Are there any definitive answers when it comes to UX? How do you balance advocating for the user against business goals? And how many users do you need to test with? In a Q&A session during our New York Virtual UX conference, Jacob Nielsen addressed these questions and his famous 5-user rule.
It is definitely a balance because you can't only advocate for the user, even though I always like to say that that's our job, right? We are the user advocates, and the only stakeholder not at the meeting is the user. Everybody else, the marketing, the engineering guys, everybody else there, they're in the meeting, but the actual customer is not in the meeting. And that's our job to represent the voice of the customer. And that is true. But at the same time, you can't just only drive to that and say, well, who cares about the company is going to make no money and go out of business next week? Well, if you go out of business next week, you're not going to have a quality product to deliver to these customers. So it's clearly extremely important that we deliver business value. That's also what we're being paid for, more pragmatically speaking. Whether we are employees or we're consultants or whatever, we're being paid to go and deliver some business value. So from all these different perspectives, we have to deliver business value. But I think a lot of the conflict between the two, customer advocacy and business value, comes from your time perspective. Because if you have a very short-term time perspective, you may think that we can just mess with the users and cheat them, maybe even, and do a bad user experience, and we can squeeze out a little more money out of them next week. And that's probably true, to be honest. Quite often you can do that. By bad design, you can make more money on a short-term basis. But on the long-term basis, and this is again what I think where you can flip the perspective, the longer-term perspective, a lot of value comes from customer loyalty. And we know, as endless business studies is already, that you make much more money from loyal customers than from the first-time customer. And how do you create customer loyalty? Well, a variety of ways, but basically by delivering what people want and need in a nice way, that they like you and they like using you, and they're using your website and using your product and having good experience. And all the various things that are really what we would advocate from a strict usability perspective, a strict purely experience perspective. Those are some of the things that actually drive that longer term value. So over the next year or the next 10 years, or whatever long term perspective, you will get more value from delivering a good user experience. And so I think that's a counter argument quite sometimes. But I mean, scale it all back to kind of pragmatics, which is, yeah, you've got it. All these things are trade-offs, and you can't just only drive for one thing, or you're going to get an unbalanced product out at the end. So it has to be a balance, and we have to. I think we can proudly say we will advocate for, if you can think of, if we can balance, we will sort of advocate for this, the balance going this way, but we will have to remember the balance can't go, so you tip over, right? Clearly you cannot do that either. So we can advocate for one direction while remembering the other direction is justified as well, and then come to some reasonable middle ground.
Thank you, Jacob. I loved you falling over. So actually, I see you here today. Charles Passato had asked, are there then any, definitive answers when it comes to web usability, or is it all subjective? If he's looking at a lot of articles, thinking about things that we read in our course, like so many places have different answers. So what do you do?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a false dichotomy to say that there's either everything has one single answer or everything is subjective and whatever I think. Neither of those two is really true in user experience, because it's such a broad, multifaceted field that there's rarely a single solution. I mean, we will often say that something is a usability guideline if we believe that it's true in about 90% of cases. That's my kind of like meta guideline, or guideline for guidelines, is that if something is true in the vast majority of cases, we'll make that a recommendation. But that doesn't mean that it's always true. I mean, there will be those, roughly speaking, 10% of cases where you should do something different because the circumstance, the context requires something different. And now I do want to say here that people always think, oh, I'm different, I'm special, and therefore they should just ignore the usability guidelines. And that's wrong, because probabilities are in favor of being in the 90% of usual cases. So you're most likely only a little different, not enough different to violate the guideline. But even so, I mean, the guideline is only a guideline. It's not like 100% hard truth. That's always the case. Uh, but the other extreme is completely false also, which is we know nothing about usability. Any design is as good as any other design, and whatever I prefer is the one we should ship. That's a prescription for disaster. I mean, like a terrible, terrible product. There's a lot we do know. I mean, we just don't. There are a few like really hardcore firm psychology rules, but they're relatively few. Like the Fitts law and a few other rules of that nature that are relatively firm. But most of them are sort of a little bit amorphous because we're talking about the human brain and not just that, but organizational behavior and social behavior and very broad systems that don't have like single very clean answers, but there definitely are answers, and there definitely are things to know that can guide us towards saying this is a better design than that design. So it's definitely not a matter of anybody's opinion is as good as any other opinion, because there are definitely things, there's a lot of things we know, and yet we don't know them 100%. We know them, let's say 90% as a rough estimate.
Thank you, Jacob. And actually, I noticed there was kind of a good follow-up question to this that came through the Zoom chat. So Ryland had asked around, you know, does that 5 user rule still stand, even though it was formulated, about 20 years ago? I guess why does it still stand, or are there any changes there that you were thinking about?
I think it actually very much does stand. So the rule is that if you test with about 5 users, and it is about, but if you test with about 5 users, you will have learned a very large percentage of what you will ever learn if you test that same design. And so if you have budget for more than 5 users, which I would always recommend because I like doing more user research, you're better off spending it on several small studies and doing iterative design and testing it and doing something new, rather than spending 30 users, 50 users, 100 users, and keep testing the same thing. And the reason this continues to be true is that it's because people are different, but they're not 100% different. In other words, if you have one design, and that's what we're talking about, if you have a specific design you want to know about it, and you're testing it with some users, well, different people will use it in different ways. And this is why it's not enough to just test with one user, because the next person will do something sort of different. But people are not like 100% different either. I mean, there's a lot of commonalities. And so the second user will do some of the same as the first user. And then experience just shows that if you keep adding people who do a little bit something differently and other things the same, there's going to be more and more of the similarity building up as you test more people. And so as you get to, so again, around 5, it's not as if you couldn't do 6, but usually this from person number 6, you're sitting there yawning and saying, I'm seeing the same thing again. And why keep doing that? Rather go back to the drawing board, use what you learned from those 5 people, change the design to make it better, hopefully better, right? And maybe you didn't, maybe you failed, because not all redesigns are for the better. And so you test that with another 5 users and you discover whether it's better or worse. And also you discover there's some new things that should be fixed and all. You just keep doing that. Another lesson that has been true for all my entire career is an iterative design. The more iterations, the better. You can always make it better. There is no perfect user interface. There's just so many dimensions of interface design that we will never design the perfect user interface. It can always get better. So every single time you can try something out and discover whether it's better or worse and keep improving. You really can always keep improving. So that's the thing to really drive for is, as many iterations as possible. And since it is a fact of life that there's only a limited amount of budget, I mean, nobody, even the richest company, are not infinitely rich. So there's always a budget available. And so whatever budget you have, right, you got to allocate in such a way that you can do as many iterations as possible, because that drives the design quality up. And that means small studies and many of them. And that's sort of based on some, I would say, kind of fundamental fact of how it is to go about studying stuff with humans. And the stuff changes, right? Whether you're testing a mainframe interface or a PC interface or a website or a mobile app or a phone watch interface or wall interface or virtual reality or the voice interface. I mean, for all of these type of things, it's the same general point, which is that they can always get better, But if you have multiple people use them, they will sort of tend to use them in approximately the same way. Because also remember that usability studies is a debugging methodology. It's actually sort of similar to if you have a piece of programming code and you're trying to find a bug, a programming error. Here we're trying to find a design error. And so you kind of like hit on this interface a number of times, and at some point in time you've sort of learned about, you haven't learned everything because there's infinitely many things that you could learn, but it's just worth it to find that last minute little thing, rather do the redesign and test again.